Hey everyone, welcome back to another video. In this one, I'm looking at how the ultimates do in PvP, so that's Timeline, and Alliance Conquest. Many of you seem to really like the PvP content that I put up, and since I'm a little late reviewing these characters, I thought I would start with the PvP review first, so I wouldn't keep everyone waiting. Usually I like to do the PvE side first, since it gives you a better idea of what the base damage for the character is or how good their upgrade is. And I'm still going to be doing that, but this time around I'm going to be leaving it for the next video. I saw that the first impression for many people regarding the Ultimates update wasn't that great, but I think that leaned more into the way that the characters performed in PvE. And they're not really as bad as people think, but this update really shined in terms of how much better these characters got for PvP. Though you don't have to take my word for it, the results speak for themselves. Before I show you the testing that I did, here are what my cards look like. I think it's important to be upfront with the stats that I have so people know how these characters are performing when you get stats at this level. That said, I am facing opponents at a high level of Alliance Conquest, so their card builds shouldn't be too far off, and in Timeline I'm testing mostly against myself and my teammates that have similar builds. The point of these tests, after all, is to show you how the characters perform versus similar builds or ones near the same level, and not to show you just versus any opponent and steamroll them. Otherwise, you really wouldn't get a fair assessment of what the character can do. Anyway, with that out of the way, the first character I'm looking at is the Superstar, Blue Marvel. He arguably got the best upgrade just from his uniform alone. Not only can he solo characters and even teams now, but his uniform passive makes him a support character as well. Basically, if an enemy character gets debuffed, which is pretty much all the time in Timeline and Alliance Conquest, specifically for the highest meta or the best characters, then Blue Marvel provides a 30% damage increase to your team or yourself. On top of that, Blue Marvel also gets an additional 30% increased damage when he uses his third skill, which is the new effect called Mockery. The way that this new mechanic works is that essentially once this debuff is applied to the enemy, they can no longer have an invincible effect active, but they do gain 10% increased damage. To add to that, this effect can't be removed by debuff and also prevents the use of barriers, shields, and damage immune. So basically, once Blue Marvel applies this effect to you, the only way you can kind of protect against it is to have a CTP of regen to have that HP shield that can't be cancelled. If you're playing manual, one thing you can do when this effect is applied is go into your iframes, since Blue Marvel doesn't have iframe ignore, but if you're in Alliance Conquest, then it's kind of out of your hands. If you have an invincible effect, such as from a CTP of Authority, Patience, Transcendence, or even from your skills, then it won't matter, he'll go right through it with all of his skills. Furthermore, if he uses this effect in Alliance Conquest, your other teammates can also hit that one character that is affected by Mockery, even if they don't have penetration, since that character can no longer get the invincible, damage immune effects and so on. To add to that, in Alliance Conquest, characters would get 60% increased damage, so one from the debuff if the enemy has that on their team, and also an additional 30 from the Mockery, which is a 60% increase versus any team, which is pretty insane. If you're thinking, oh, that Mockery won't really happen that frequently in Alliance Conquest or even in Timeline on auto, his rotation AI is basically 3, 5, and then 4 if the third's an up. So in essence, he's always applying the third skill. And since both of those skills have buffs, he's essentially at 85% increased damage all the time, and if he's fighting a character with debuff, he's at 115. To add to that, if he uses his fourth skill, which has 100% increased damage for that skill, he'll be at 215. So this is one of the reasons why he can essentially almost one-shot characters even at T2. And if that wasn't enough, the two skills that he spams consistently, the third and the fifth, have super guard break. So what this means is that if the character is caught in these skills, they're basically stuck head rocking even if they have guard break immunity. Taking all those damage buffs into consideration, the build option that I think would be best for him in terms of PvP would be a CTP of Regeneration. You could also use a CTP of Authority, though if you face another Blue Marvel, especially in Timeline, then that Invincible won't really do anything for you. The same is also true if you're using a CTP of Patience or Transcendence. And because he has super armor natively in his kit, you can use those two options as well. Some people have tried proc builds with him, but in modes like Alliance Conquest, you kind of want him to be alive as long as possible to apply that mockery effect. So I think a defensive or survival based build is probably the most ideal. If you've been paying attention to the timeline footage, you'll see just how crazy he is as a character, even without a revive like some of the other top PvP metas. I'm showing this last test that I did twice because I think it's honestly insane. I threw Blue Marvel on a team with no supports or debuff lead versus some of my top characters. So that's a Sentry with a brilliant regen, Dormammu with a mighty regen, and a Jean with a brilliant regen. And he took down every single one. If you're wondering how to stop Blue Marvel, his greatest weakness is Reflect and a character that is very heavy in iframes. Since Blue Marvel doesn't have many iframes, then he's really susceptible to reflect damage. And due to the fact that he has no iframe ignore, a character with heavy iframes can avoid his mockery and avoid most of his damage. Moving on to Alliance Conquest, since I saw how well Blue Marvel did versus metas in Timeline, I decided to start off versus some bigger sets in Conquest. Before outright trying a solo with the character, I wanted to see how Blue Marvel would pair with the rest of the roster. Seeing how well Yelena did in my previous tests on the Falcon and the Winter Soldier update, I paired her with Blue Marvel to see how she would do versus a Sentry and a Thanos with Colossus support. As you can see, it went pretty well. For this next test, I was kind of messing around with this solo team of using Odin and Ebony Maw as a support. It's not really a solo team since Odin and Maw are really strong, but I wanted to see if Blue Marvel would survive Null's third skill and Phyla's Reflect. Since he was able to survive versus Null, I bumped down the leadership to someone a little bit less strong, Doom, which needs his T3, and from Maw down to Phyla, just for that extra damage. You can see that with the other two characters dying, he's the one that's taking down Sentry and Null. So then for this final solo test, I bumped down the leadership even lower to someone like Angel, who doesn't really do too much, and from Phyla to Taskmaster, so there's no reflect coming from her part, and this is solely on Blue Marvel to solo these characters. As you can easily see, he's amazing. Just from the tests that I've done in Timeline and Alliance Conquest, I'd say that he is a must-have for these modes. I wouldn't be surprised if he starts popping up all over Timeline, especially when Maw or Colossus is banned. And the great thing is, like Maw's passive, Blue Marvel's passive isn't nullified by Molecule Man's leadership. Now that you can see what the character can do solo, this team here is one of the reasons why he is so good for PvP. Not only is he great by himself, but he basically supercharges any other character that you have on the team. If you have him with very strong characters like Sentry, he essentially can carry the entire fight even if Blue Marvel dies. You see just that here when the strong meta Defenders team takes down Blue Marvel, specifically Daredevil using his fourth skill that has the super guard break. Regardless, Sentry is so strong it doesn't matter that Blue Marvel died. You'll likely see that team up more frequently in Alliance Conquest, so here is one of the teams that I use to counter Sentry in general, but also Sentry with Blue Marvel. Strife provides the debuff and a lot of incapacitation to remove buffs from the enemy team. Vision provides the reflect that I mentioned Blue Marvel is susceptible to, as well as Sentry. And Deadpool tends to iframe a lot, as well as having that good survival and iframe ignore, so he can keep putting on damage on top of the reflect and the capacitation. The next character I'm looking at is America Chavez, and she used to be a useless character, but now she's actually pretty good. She's really tanky now because she has a lot of stuff added to her kit. She has extra HP, reduction to damage, reduction to reflect, a lot of iframes, and a heal. She's pretty good on the offense side as well. Her fifth has a pretty decent length iframe, and can penetrate all the way up to invincible at a 40% chance. In addition to this, she also has an iframe ignore on her third skill, which is great when you throw her versus speed types that iframe a lot. She has super armor natively in her kit, so if you wanted to use something like a Transcendence, a Patience, or even an Obelisk, you could do that. You could also use something like a CTP of Authority, but the one that I went with was Regen because she is kind of tanky, she has a lot of HP, she has that healing, and that goes really well with the CTP of Regen. If you don't have 100 regenerations lying around, then an Obelisk or Transcendence should be more than enough. I was testing with an Invincible Obelisk for the most part, and she did really well. I didn't really try with a damage proc. A CTP of Destruction would be a little bit redundant if she used her 5th skill because the penetration from it would never activate. The damage proc itself would actually be pretty good, so I was thinking that a CTP of Greed might be pretty decent for her, but I didn't get to try that. If you do end up trying that, let me know how it works for you. The first test that I'm doing in Alliance Conquest with Chavez is to see if she can solo a relatively strong speed type. In this clip, I'm only using Warwolf as a support, I'm not using a debuff leadership, and I'm fighting a full support Deadpool. I have a pretty minimalist build on here. I don't have any Urus, and I only have the Obelisk, but as you can clearly see, she doesn't have much issue taking out Deadpool. For the next test, I decided to take on Deadpool and another decent character like X-23, and as you can see, because my other 2 characters died, this is a full solo. Her AI rotation is actually really good. Most of the times she stays in her 5th skill, which has that penetration and is the long iframe, and she frequently uses her iframe ignore. Because she's doing pretty well, naturally I'm ramping up to stronger teams with her. In this one, I'm only using Beast as a leadership, but I still don't have any debuff. Although Doom isn't as great as he should be, he does have that revive and native penetration, which could cause her some trouble since she has Invincible for my build, but clearly that's not the case. I didn't really test her versus meta teams. I'm not too sure if she can handle it because her damage output isn't the highest. I'm sure she can do pretty well though overall. But for the most part, since I have other characters that can take on meta teams, she is a really good counter to strong speed types. Since we got some pretty good ones last patch, such as Yelena and Falcon, she's a good option against them. I did do one test though with some decently strong characters like Proxima, Quicksilver, and Black Widow, and even though some of the credit can go to Gladiator in this fight, you can see just how durable and good her survival is since she barely even gets to half health. And the best part of that is that the longer she survives, the more chance there is that she'll basically instantly wipe out the team with her awakening skill, especially if it goes into the second fight like this one. Black Panther was one of the characters that people weren't really happy with his newest uniform. I do agree that he could have gotten a bit more, at the very least the heal, and possibly even physical reflect, since in the movies he ends up taking that damage, charging it up, and shooting it back at the opponent. If that's kind of a stretch, then I don't really see why he didn't get something like invisibility, since his character is pretty much known for stealth. Regardless, saying that this uniform is not good or not worth getting is a little bit of a stretch compared to the uniform that he had previously. As you can see from the timeline clip, the biggest benefit of the newest uniform is much higher damage as well as really good burst damage. His survival doesn't really change too much, so if you wanted to improve that, you can go again with things like regen or authority. Regen might work pretty well because his HP pool is really high because of that T3 stat bump, and because combat types have a high HP pool in general. That said, I haven't really tried a survival based build on Black Panther. I kind of prefer the burst damage to get rid of the metas before they get their strong skills and buffs up. The build that I'm currently testing him with is a CTP of Destruction because he doesn't have that native penetration, so it helps him a lot. And I found that it works really well because that damage proc usually lands on the 3, 4, or 5, and any of those skills basically turns into a one-shot with his newest uniform. Just keep in mind though that if you do use a damage proc and use him against meta characters, he's gonna be a little bit of a hit and miss because if those procs don't kill the character, then you're likely gonna end up dying. But in general, that's kind of what you get when you use a damage proc, and if a character doesn't have too great survival, it's not really the best idea to invest very heavily in trying to make them survive. Sometimes building offensively can end up being the best form of defense. First team that I'm taking him up against here are iframe ignore characters like Rogue and Nova, and it's to see if he can kill them before they can kill him. That test wasn't necessarily the best one since the team didn't have a debuff leadership, though Captain America does have a self debuff. Regardless, you can see how quickly Black Panther can take out the enemies with a damage proc. For the second test, it's nearly identical. There's Rogue and Captain America, but this time they have a debuff leadership, and I have a slightly better leadership, having that little damage increase from Thane and a little bit of extra survival with Victoria's support. You can see that even with a damage proc, Black Panther's survival is actually pretty decent, especially with his T3 stat bump and Victoria's support giving him that really massive HP pool. It basically gives him enough time to proc on one of his skills and take out the enemy team. Here I wanted to see if Strife would hit Black Panther before he would go into his iframes and stop him with incapacitation from being able to do anything. His iframe skills are really quick though, which is another reason why it works really well with a damage proc build. Even though this fight was strafed, you can see how quick those iframes are, or the priority of the iframes, since he can hit characters like Falcon who tend to iframe a lot and have invincible up very frequently. In addition to that, you can also see that his survival is enough for him to take care of the enemy like before. For this last test, I wanted to see if Black Panther could take out stronger characters like Jean and Thanos by himself, and not just use him against characters that he has a type advantage versus. That damage proc on the 3rd, 4th, and 5th skill, and sometimes even the 2nd skill, can take out most characters relatively quickly and easily. Again, the downside is if you're using him versus stronger characters, especially ones with revive, then he might not survive the revenge from the revived character, which unfortunately was the case here, but you can see how well he performed regardless. And just to be clear, I'm not advocating building him in this way, I'm just showing you how he does and the benefits and drawbacks of doing so. Obviously in the end, it's always up to you how you want to build your characters and what you want from them. Spectrum is the new character that came with the Ultimates update, and in terms of her PvP performance, she is really good for a character with no uniform. Her survival is really good thanks to several tools in her kit, including a 60% energy damage reduction on her passive skill, damage immunity on her 2nd skill, heal and invincible on her 3rd skill, as well as relatively long iframes on her 4th and 5th skill. In addition to this, her 1st and 2nd skill also have a 70% chance of the opponent missing their attack while those skills are active. This level of survival makes her even better when you awaken her, since she can go into that skill to wipe out characters in both Timeline and Alliance Conquest. As you can see from the Timeline clip, her offensive capabilities are also relatively good, since she's able to take out top meta characters without too much struggle. And this is due to the high damage on her 3rd, 4th, and 5th skill, as well as having the accumulation on her 3rd skill for damage dealt, and having 50% penetration to all kind of defenses on the 5th skill. In terms of how you want to build her, you have a lot of options. The one that I personally went with was a CTP of Authority, and that's because she doesn't have a uniform, so I need more sources to kind of fill out her stats to max them out. And that crit damage from the Authority is really helpful to do that. Because of her 3rd skill having that heal and the invincible, a regen might work better for her, but for most players it might be harder to use that, especially because a regen is very useful for most characters, and because you'll have to make up a lot of stats for her due to that lack of the uniform. As to why I went with a more defensive build, it's because I think her damage is good enough, especially when she's able to take out meta characters without a damage proc, and because the longer she's alive, the more opportunities she has to go in her different skills and get those buffs up, and if she lives long enough, she'll go into her Awakening skill. I didn't test out a CTP of Destruction because I think she rotates through most of her skills kind of quickly, so you wouldn't get the full benefit of that 200% proc, and because she has that 50% penetration on her 5th skill that lasts for 5 seconds, so the penetration from the destruction wouldn't really activate if she uses her 5th skill, which is pretty often. That said, a CTP of Greed might actually be pretty good for her because she goes through all those different iframes, and you have the penetration from the 5th already there. Because I was a little late with her potential, I didn't get to test her too thoroughly in Alliance Conquest, but from the results that I saw, she looked like she had potential to be pretty good. First test doesn't necessarily show that, since Nova might have helped her out a little bit more than I expected. Regardless, this team is pretty interesting since you can use Malekith to give you a debuff as well as energy defense, which combines really well with her energy mitigation from her passive. All of that survival versus energy types should give her a strong presence to counter energy characters in the game. You don't necessarily have to use her versus energy characters. In the second test, I'm trying to show how good her damage is, even with a survival based build, using only her leadership, Wasp to debuff, and Shuri as a support. One interesting detail about her kit is that if she uses her 5th skill and she's interrupted by something like an iframe ignore, once the 5th skill is cast, it'll continue that barrage of damage regardless. Another nice thing about the 5th skill, if you might have missed it in the last clip, which I'm showing again, is that the 5th skill has a little bit of a wind up, but when she activates it, the skill applies paralysis. You'll see that when she uses her 5th skill, characters around her will basically be frozen, and then she'll go into her barrage, and most often that'll be enough to take out the characters. Unfortunately, in this last test, the zone was strafed, so you don't get to see her fully take out the characters, but you can see that she can do it regardless. She works well on teams that have a strong energy meta character and a strong physical character like Hulk. And that's due to her tier 2 passive like I mentioned before, but also to her tier 1 passive, which is that when she gets hit, she has a 100% chance to dodge physical damage for up to 5 seconds. Another character that got a solid upgrade with her uniform was Captain Marvel. Although she was relatively really strong when she came out, she has kind of fallen off in terms of the meta or her performance relative to other characters. This is largely due to the fact that her biggest strength was that she had an iframe ignore and her damage increase versus villain characters. As more characters that could be upgraded either to a Transcendence or a T3 got an iframe ignore, her greatest strength kind of fell off by the wayside. In order to make up for that, the devs doubled down on her strength versus supervillains by increasing her damage, mitigation, and overall mitigation a ridiculous amount. They gave her 35 additional damage dealt to supervillains on top of what she had before, as well as an additional 40% less damage taken from supervillains, again on top of what she had before, and 45% increased damage mitigation overall. So that means she got 50% increased damage versus supervillains, 50% less taken from supervillains, and 40% damage mitigation overall. If you combine that with supports that reduce damage from supervillains further, and the fact that she is now a supervillain with this uniform herself, she barely takes any damage from these characters. She's basically become the definitive Thanos killer. In regards to builds, again, you can kind of use anything with her because she does have super armor, and her passive also increases the effects of procs from things like CTPs and obelisks. The build that I went with is a CTP of destruction because that 4th skill iframe combined with penetration and the proc essentially one-shots any kind of character. And the fact that she's more durable overall now makes it a little bit easier to buff up her offensive side. Even though she lacks penetration, the fact that the destruction CTP basically makes any skill a one-shot leads me to believe that a CTP of greed might actually be really good for her. The reasoning behind that is that if a single skill damage proc can turn one skill into an insta-kill, things like a greed that have a buff or proc over multiple skills will turn multiple of those skills into insta-kills. Because her 5th is on a lower cooldown now and does good damage, then the 5th, 3rd, and 4th are all good candidates for it. The other good thing on auto is that she no longer needs to have her 5th activated to increase the damage on her other skills. On this uniform, all the skills aren't dependent on the 5th one. Naturally, the first character that I wanted to test against was Thanos because she's such a strong counter versus him. To be honest, I don't think I even needed a good leadership or support to win this fight. Black Order was next since they're so much stronger with their newest uniforms. And as you can see, her capability to counter villain types has skyrocketed off the charts. That becomes even more apparent in this next fight where I fight a stronger team that has revives, including Mephisto and Dormammu with the Reflect. You'll notice that even though I don't have a defensive based build, her survival is really good versus villain opponents. Since I'm going to be using her versus top villain metas in Alliance Conquest, my mentality is that I want to build her offensively to take out the opponent before they get all their buffs and skills up to be able to take her out. For example, I could have have built her with authority or a defensive build, but fighting characters like Thanos that can strip away your buffs, or a character like Hulk that has the iframe ignore, could cause trouble for her. The mitigation versus villains is really noticeable now, but the mitigations that she has on her uniform just as is also really noticeable. Like, I didn't expect her to survive versus the Warriors of the Sky Awaken skill, but her frequent iframes and that high mitigation value basically pulled her through. You might have also noticed that I'm using a particular team frequently, and that's usually Doom, Captain Marvel, and Shuri. I've been using this combo for a really long time because I think it works really well. So if you wanted some ideas on how to team up your Captain Marvel, this is one example. Shuri works even better now since she gives that additional villain damage mitigation to Captain Marvel, which stacks with her uniform one. Doom obviously gives the debuff and some penetration, and because he has 2 lives, he can help Captain Marvel do additional damage. If you want to use Shuri elsewhere, you can also use Phi Lavelle to get that reflect and extra damage to both Doom and Captain Marvel. The last character left to look at is Quasar. Without her uniform, Quasar can't really do much of anything, and the uniform is really where she gets that much better. Even though her skills look like they have barely changed, her newest uniform makes her significantly better, almost to the point where I would say she's the second best PvP character of this update behind Blue Marvel. Her newest uniform gives her a lot of damage mitigation, and best of all, her tier 1 passive that provided a 50% HP shield when she's debuffed now also cleanses the debuffs. This is really good in conjunction with her skill rotation, or the AI's skill rotation, because she mostly goes into her 3rd, 4th, and 5th skill, which are the best for her. The 3rd skill now provides her with damage immunity and paralysis. The 4th skill provides her with a heal and 50% chance to penetrate all defenses. And the 5th skill provides her with damage accumulation for damage done, as well as 3 seconds of invincible. To add to this, the 4th and 5th skills have iframes on them, so she's regularly rotating between these and avoiding damage. More often than not, her AI goes into the 5th skill first, which has the damage accumulation on it, and then the 4th skill essentially one-shots a character even if you don't have a damage proc. Taking that into consideration, and that the tier 1 passive provides an HP shield, the build that I went with was a CTP of regen. The HP bump from her Transcendence isn't too high for you to immediately think of going to regen, but she has that HP shield from the passive as well as the heal that work well with a regen. Keeping that in mind, I did use a CTP of Authority initially in my tests, and then a regen later on at the end. I didn't notice a drastic difference, though I probably will if I ended up reforging the regen later on. Similar to Spectrum, her skills are kind of quick, so if you want to use a CTP of Destruction, I don't think you'll get too much benefit off of the proc or the penetration. Instead, using a CTP of Greed might actually give you a better result. Also similar to Spectrum, I went with a defensive build because she can take out the enemies without a proc, and the longer she stays alive, the more chance she has to get her accumulation up and her penetration, as well as going into her awakening skill. The first team that I'm testing Quasar against is a relatively simple one. It's versus an Inhumans team with no debuff leadership and only with Nova support. For my team, I'm not using a debuff leadership since she has it built in herself, so that gives me the flexibility of using a damage leadership like Hela, which not only provides me with increased damage, but I also take less damage from hero types. For the second test, I use pretty much the same team, so no support, but this time face a stronger team, that being the Black Order. In this test, I can't show you how high her limit is because these characters aren't T3 and Transcended, but Corvus is awakened and she does survive his awakening skill, which gives you some idea of her offensive and survival capabilities. Since I saw how well she did versus a non-upgraded Black Order team, the next test was obviously to see how she would fare against an upgraded one. I did use Nova as a decently strong 3rd, though he died relatively quickly, but luckily you can see how well Quasar did since she soloed all the characters almost instantly, and like the previous clip, she was able to survive Corvus's awakening skill. You can see how good her skill priority is since she immediately goes into her 5th as Corvus begins his awakening skill, and then when Corvus finishes its iframe from the awakening, she immediately goes into her fort. On top of this, her skills do move her around quite a bit, which adds to her survival since some characters have to chase her down to get in range to use their skills. Because she was doing so well with the Hela leadership, I decided to keep using it, and to fight some of the bigger metas, I decided to also try out Lavelle. You might be thinking that for Jean's first life, she might have died to reflect damage, but you can see that in the second life, Quasar can take her out relatively easily. Not only this, but because she has that HP shield passive in her kit, and if you're using a regen another HP shield, she can also survive Null's extended first life, or essentially double life, especially when he uses his third skill that has the 100% chance to penetrate all defenses. You might be thinking that regen CTP might not be great since she does have her own shield and the shields won't overlap if they activate at the same time. Fortunately, her HP shield passive doesn't activate when she's at 50% health but when debuffed, and usually a debuff happens almost instantly in a fight. So that means that she's going to get that shield first, and then once that's burned out, her health will drop to the 50% mark and she'll get the one from regen. However, if she survives past 15 seconds and her HP is below 50% health, that's where the shields might clash with one another. This is another reason why I recommended Authority, but most fights don't really go too much past 15 seconds, so it isn't an issue that you'll likely run into often. Sadly, this last test was also strafed, so I couldn't show you the full totality of how good she is, but you can get the idea here when she makes quick work of some of the top metas in Alliance Conquest. Not being able to do much of anything in PvP and being able to now take out top PvP metas, including revive metas, is a pretty drastic improvement if you ask me, especially when she's doing it all by herself on a solo team. Rounds out the PvP testing for the ultimates. The PvE side wasn't as great as many people hoped for, and you'll see that in my next video, though I don't think it's as bad as some people are making it out to be. If you want to know which uniforms to prioritize, I would recommend going with Blue Marvel first, and then with Quasar second, and Captain Marvel third. Blue Marvel is an absolute powerhouse, and Quasar goes from being able to do nothing and essentially being a useless character for PvP for the most part to being really good. Captain Marvel is also really good, but her previous uniform isn't really that bad, so the upgrade that you get isn't insanely drastic as getting a uniform for Quasar, for example. Chavez is also really good, and I would say probably get her 4th, and then Black Panther would be 5th. Again, similar to Captain Marvel, Black Panther does get significantly better with his newest uniform, but Chavez is basically useless without a uniform, so the level of upgrade that you get, you have to kind of take that into consideration. In terms of character upgrades, I would say Awakening Quasar would give you the most value, and hopefully you can transcend her too. And then for second, it's tied between Awakening for Spectrum and Chavez. You might be surprised that I didn't say to T3 Blue Marvel first, and that's because the majority of his value comes from his uniform. Don't get me wrong, getting that stat bump will definitely help you in PvP, but the majority of the value will be from the uniform. So in terms of where you might get the most value with your upgrades, it would probably be from the Awakenings or Transcendence, since they can wipe out a full second team. I apologize that the video is a bit late, but hopefully you found the video useful or helpful. I also know that the video is fairly long for most people, so I did timestamp it so people can jump around and see what they're most interested in. These videos do take some time to put together, so if you did enjoy it, please consider leaving a comment, subscribing, hitting that bell notification, and liking it if you did like it. I'll do my best to answer any questions in the comments, but that's pretty much the video. Thanks for your time and watching, but the video is now over.